At 75 years old, Don Johnson finally said what many had long suspected but never thought he would openly admit. For decades, his marriage to Melanie Griffith had been portrayed as a Hollywood whirlwind passion. Breakups, reconciliations, and the chaos that comes with fame. To the outside world, they were the glamorous couple who could never stay apart. Behind the scenes, however, their love story was shaped by addiction, heartbreak, secrets neither of them dared to reveal. Now, after a lifetime of silence, Johnson has spoken about what truly happened between them. It is far from the fairy tale fans imagined. It reshapes everything people thought they knew about one of Hollywood's most dramatic romances. His confession has stunned many and raised the question of whether love was ever enough to keep them together. The story of Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith began with a level of intensity that few relationships could survive. Melanie was only 14 when she first crossed paths with Johnson, who was 22 and determined to make it in Hollywood. Her mother, actress Tippi Hedren, was already a celebrated figure for her role in Hitchcock's The Birds. And it was through her circle that Melanie met Johnson. To outsiders, it may have seemed like just another introduction within Hollywood's social scene. Their connection was immediate, and instead of a slow, careful courtship, Melanie was swept into something she was too young to fully understand. Many saw the pairing as magnetic, an irresistible combination of charisma and rebellion. Others saw it as scandalous, defined by a troubling age gap and an imbalance of power. But Melanie was captivated. She believed she had found the great love of her life, one that would cast a shadow over every future relationship. By 15, she had moved into Johnson's home, a decision that shocked even those familiar with the free-spirited atmosphere of the 1970s. Friends and family expressed concern, and her mother admitted she feared for her daughter's future. Still, Melanie was convinced Johnson was her destiny. Johnson later said he was drawn to her youthful energy, beauty, and unpredictable nature. Yet even in those early days, cracks were forming. Their relationship, driven more by intensity than stability, lacked the foundation needed to withstand the pressures of Johnson's career ambitions and Melanie's still developing identity. What they created together felt electric in the moment, but it carried the seeds of inevitable destruction. They married in 1976 when Melanie turned 18. To some, it seemed like the natural progression of their fiery relationship, but in reality, it was a leap into chaos. The marriage lasted only 6 months before collapsing under immaturity, instability, and relentless emotional strain. Johnson would later describe it as a storm they were unprepared to face. While Melanie admitted she had been young and dumb, consumed by feelings she couldn't fully navigate, the turbulence was obvious. Too much passion, heavy partying, no real grounding to sustain a lifelong partnership. Still, the fire between them never truly died. Even after their divorce, they kept circling back to each other in ways that confused outsiders, but made perfect sense to them. Melanie compared every new relationship to what she had felt with Johnson, and Johnson acknowledged that she had left an indelible mark on his life. She defined his youth, and he shaped a path for her filled with highs and lows she could never quite escape. Their beginnings were messy, intoxicating, and dangerous, but powerful enough to draw them together again and again over the decades. It was within that intensity that the seeds of regret and later confession were planted. Though Johnson would not speak of them publicly until age and time stripped away the glamour. After their brief first marriage ended, many assumed their story was finished. Two young, impulsive stars had burned bright and burned out even faster. But as the 1970s turned into the 1980s, a new chapter began. Johnson finally found the role that launched him into superstardom, Sonny Crockett on Miami Vice. Overnight, he became the face of a cultural phenomenon. His style, confidence, and screen presence made him one of the most recognizable actors of the decade. And for a while, it seemed he had left the turbulence of his past behind. Meanwhile, Melanie was carving out her own space in Hollywood, determined not to live in her mother's shadow. She pushed herself to take on roles that highlighted her vulnerability and strength. By the mid-1980s, she was emerging as a star in her own right, with films like Something Wild and later Working Girl, cementing her status as one of the industry's most compelling leading women to the public. Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith appeared to be thriving. their careers rising in spectacular fashion. Magazine covers, award shows, and red carpets painted the picture of two stars who had finally reached the peak of success. Behind the scenes, however, both were crumbling under the weight of their personal demons. Drugs and alcohol were not occasional escapes, they were constants in their lives. Johnson and Griffith have both spoken openly about their battles with addiction, and those struggles seeped into every part of their relationship. Hollywood in the 1980s was a place where excess was often mistaken for normalcy, and the culture only intensified their downward spiral. They embraced the highs, the parties, the late nights, and the numbing escape fame made so easy, but the inevitable lows were devastating. Melanie moved in and out of rehabilitation centers, fighting for sobriety but often falling back into destructive habits. Johnson later admitted that he lived recklessly during this period, acting as though consequences were problems for another time. Despite everything, they found their way back to each other yet again. In 1989, more than 10 years after their first disastrous marriage, they walked down the aisle a second time. The world took notice. Johnson was one of TV's biggest stars. Melanie had just earned critical acclaim for Working Girl, a performance that brought her a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination. They seemed unstoppable, a glamorous couple reborn. Their daughter, Dakota Johnson, arrived that same year, giving fans hope that this time their story might truly have a happy ending. To the outside world, it looked like redemption. Two stars, who had conquered their demons and found their way back to the love that had defined their youth. But the reality was far more complicated. The fractures from their past had never fully healed, and addiction remained a constant shadow. They loved each other intensely, but that love was inseparable from chaos. For Melanie, Johnson represented passion and danger, a sense of belonging she never quite found anywhere else. For Johnson, she was the one person who could match his intensity and challenge him in ways no one else dared. At their best, they inspired one another and shared moments of genuine closeness that neither seems to have forgotten. At their worst, they became mirrors reflecting back the wounds they each tried so hard to hide. Their second marriage burned as brightly and as briefly as their first. By the early 1990s, old habits resurfaced, pulling them toward another collapse. Fame, addiction, and emotional volatility created storms they could no longer weather together, and no amount of love could fully shield them from the damage. What had appeared to be a fairy tale reborn unraveled once again, leaving behind scars that would take decades to process. Although the marriage did not survive, the pain of those years planted the seeds of a truth Johnson would not admit publicly until much later. It was a truth that changed how people saw their love story. While the public followed their relationship through tabloid headlines and polished interviews, there were always whispers about what was happening behind closed doors. Hollywood thrives on speculation, and for Johnson and Griffith, those rumors were endless. Friends spoke of explosive arguments, secret separations, and betrayals neither wanted to acknowledge. Infidelity was often mentioned in connection with their relationship, though rarely with evidence. The speculation itself became part of their legend. Love and loyalty seemed constantly at war with temptation and addiction. Melanie's struggles with substances were widely known, but less reported at the time was how closely Johnson's own habits echoed hers. Insiders described a cycle in which they enabled each other's worst instincts and then crashed together, creating a relationship built more on surviving one emotional storm after another than on stability. Their second marriage, glamorous on the surface, was said to be filled with late-night fights, stretches of cold silence, and growing resentment. Another shadow hung over their relationship: Melanie's health. Years later, she would face repeated battles with skin cancer, undergoing surgeries and ongoing treatments. Even after her diagnoses, she continued to smoke heavily, worrying those closest to her. Some wondered if her health struggles were part of the truth. Johnson eventually felt compelled to admit a realization that the woman he had loved and lost repeatedly was still putting herself at risk. Even after everything they had endured, these were not just the usual troubles of a Hollywood marriage. They were deeper and more painful than anyone outside their inner circle ever truly understood. The matters they faced were never trivial. They touched on life, mortality, and heartbreak. Yet the most painful questions always revolved around what Don Johnson had kept hidden. Did he leave because the passion had faded, or was there something darker beneath the surface? Friends suggested that Johnson carried guilt over how things ended, a burden that lingered long after the divorce papers were signed. Melanie, on the other hand, was more forthcoming about her mistakes, openly acknowledging her addictions, reckless choices, and regrets. Johnson remained largely silent until much later in life, when he finally revealed a devastating truth that stunned fans who thought they knew the whole story. When Johnson turned 75, he spoke with a candor rarely seen throughout his career. For years, he had been the master of charm, deflecting difficult questions with wit, anecdotes, or humor. Marriages, personal struggles, and heartbreak were often dodged in interviews, but age brought perspective. Johnson admitted that his relationship with Melanie Griffith, though intense and passionate, had never been built on a foundation strong enough to last. The heartbreak lay not in the failure of their love, but in the unflinching way he acknowledged his own role in it. For the first time, he removed the veil of glamour and confessed that he had been incapable of providing Melanie with the stability she needed. Though he loved her deeply, his addictions, ego, and restless nature made him unfit for the role of husband and partner. "I was too selfish," he said, explaining that he had chased the thrill of fame, the temptations of excess, and the spotlight, while what she needed was consistency, devotion, and care. The blunt admission of guilt contrasted sharply with Melanie's own reflections on their past, in which she described him as the man she could never fully let go of, even after their marriages ended. To concede that he had knowingly failed her cast their entire romance in a more painful and human light. The timing of the confession added to its poignancy. At 75, Johnson was no longer the golden boy of Miami Vice, but a reflective elder statesman of Hollywood, watching Melanie face repeated health challenges, skin cancer, surgeries, and the struggle to quit smoking despite visible risks were now part of her life story. Johnson's words suggested he carried the weight of knowing he had not been there for her in the ways that mattered most, that he had left her to fight too many battles alone. Fans who had long idolized them as a glamorous couple were confronted with the human cost of fame, addiction, and personal weakness on two people who once believed they could conquer anything together in many ways. The confession humanized Johnson, the Hollywood playboy, once defined by fast cars, designer suits, and wild nights, now appeared as a man weighed down by regret. The devastation was not simply that he had hurt Melanie, but that he had known it all along and carried that knowledge for decades, only finding the courage to speak it aloud in his later years. Yet even in its honesty, the revelation raised questions. Why wait so long to admit it? How did Melanie react? And what did it mean for the bond they still shared through their daughter, Dakota, which had endured long after their romantic love had faded? The public response was mixed shock, sadness, and a measure of respect. Some applauded Johnson for finally being transparent about the destructive choices he had made. Others were struck by how long it had taken him to acknowledge what Melanie had spoken about openly for years. The confession confirmed what insiders had long suspected behind the glitz of Hollywood. Deep fractures existed that fame could not disguise. Melanie, in turn, did not react dramatically. She did not issue statements or retaliate. Her silence spoke volumes. Over the years, she had described Johnson as a defining figure in her life, while acknowledging the chaos they endured. Her focus shifted to her children, particularly Dakota, who has forged her own path in Hollywood, and to her health, which remained a constant concern. Whether or not she felt vindicated, Melanie carried herself with the resilience that has characterized her. Later years, the revelation also reframed family dynamics. Dakota has often expressed gratitude for having two parents who, despite their flaws, always loved her and supported her career. Johnson's confession suggested that his enduring sense of guilt may have shaped the care and protection he has shown as a father, remaining a steady presence in her life even as his romantic relationships faltered. Publicly, Johnson's reputation softened. the man once celebrated as the reckless playboy of Miami Vice fame became, in the eyes of fans, a 75-year-old reflecting on mistakes with honesty and humility. His acknowledgement added depth to a story that could have been dismissed as another Hollywood breakup, revealing the painful human truths behind the glitz and glamour. For fans, Johnson's confession was a stark reminder that even celebrities wrapped in success and glamour are not immune to regret and heartbreak. But it did more than reshape public perception. It's reopened a conversation about what it truly means to love someone in the spotlight. If Johnson had admitted his selfishness earlier, could things have turned out differently? Or were the forces that pulled them apart, addiction, ambition, fame, simply too strong to overcome? The answers remain uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the truth, painful though it was, had been long overdue. Looking back, the story of Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith is less about Hollywood glamour and more about the complexity of human love. They met when Melanie was barely a teenager, and Don was already pursuing his ambitions in Hollywood. From the start, their bond was defined by extremes, passion and chaos. Love and recklessness, amplified by the pressures of fame and addiction. Through it all, they never truly broke, free from each other until the weight of their mistakes became impossible to carry. Johnson's confession at 75 stripped away the romanticized veneer that tabloids had sold for decades. It was not simply a story of love lost, it was about accountability. For the first time, he admitted that he had failed to provide Melanie with the security she deserved, and that his selfishness had cost them both the chance at a lasting relationship. For fans who had idolized them as Hollywood royalty, the revelation was devastating, but it also made their story feel undeniably real. It showed that love, no matter how intense, can be undone by choices made in the heat of youth and under the glare of fame. As Melanie continues to navigate her health challenges and focus on her family, and as Johnson moves forward as a reflective elder statesman of Hollywood, their relationship remains a symbol of passion entwined with circumstance. The devastating truth he finally shared does not erase their history, it reframes it, leaving a haunting question. Was their love ever strong enough to survive, or was it always destined to end the way it did?